Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, John Macri, fantasy analyst here at PFF, and prospect season rolls on. Last week, we covered the incoming quarterback class and had a lot of fun discussion around those players. You can check that out now if you haven't already. And now today, we get to talk about a very fun, very interesting wide receiver group with a bunch of potential first rounders where maybe three of which go in the top 10. It's going to be a fun discussion here to dive into. And naturally, I couldn't do this on my own. So who better to break it all down with me than the great Kate Magdziuk, as usual. I'm looking forward, Kate, to your thoughts on this rookie wide receiver class. So how you doing today? You ready to talk some more prospects?
I'm ready to talk some more prospects. You teased it. This is an excellent wide receiver class. We're undoubtedly going to get three wide receivers here in the top 10 picks, and for very good reason. This is going to be a very fun episode, and I'm super excited because the running backs, interesting class, but not a ton of top end prospects they're all top end prospects when it comes to these wide receivers. So really, this is an interesting group because you really are kind of nitpicking a lot between some of these tier 2 wide receivers that could have a very big impact on our fantasy teams for the years to come.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. That second to third, fourth tier, I tinker with a ton. I feel pretty good, obviously, about the top guys, but we'll get into it. We'll talk our rankings and everything like that. And yeah, it's always fun talking rookies, right? I have no doubt that that'll be the case with this year's wide receiver class. We're going to cover 8 wide receivers that we picked out for today's show. Obviously, there are a ton more that we can probably cover as well because it is a pretty deep class, but we'll look at another way to potentially cover those guys on a later episode as well. So be on the lookout for that. If you are watching on the YouTubes, don't forget to like and subscribe. We'd greatly appreciate that support if you're willing, and it just helps us a ton. If you're an audio only listener, you could come on, stop on by as well, and feel free to hit like and subscribe while you're here. Let us know that you're interested in this content and enjoy the rookie content, and we will keep it rolling all draft season long. Speaking of which, before we get into the players themselves, I also want to let you all know to check out the PFF Mock Draft Simulator if you haven't already, where you can take control and draft for your favorite team or draft for the entire league, whatever you want. I know I like to draft for all teams, make my own mocks, try out different strategies for each team along the way. It's not only a great way to get ready for the actual NFL draft, which is less than a month away. It's April, officially draft month. So hop in there, make some picks, make some trades. Maybe you're a Bills fan and want to figure out some trade up possibilities to get that Stephon Diggs replacement. Either way, there's a ton of possibilities and it's a lot of fun. You can also use the promo code 30MDS right now on pff.com to get 30% off annual subscriptions, which includes all of our NFL draft content and, of course, access to the best mock draft simulator in the league here at PFF. So check it out now and go have yourself some fun. Again, that is promo code 30MDS. All right, let's get into it here. The wide receiver position, as we mentioned, is chock full of interesting prospects and some very good ones to boot, but we have to start at the top here with Ohio State's Marvin Harrison Jr. Kate, he's not necessarily everyone's top ranked wide receiver, but he is many people's wide receiver one. And with that being said, maybe let's start with a spoiler for our rankings coming later, like we did last episode with Caleb Williams. Is Marvin Harrison Jr. your wide receiver one?
Yes, he is. Next. That this wasn't even a question for me. I mean, 21 years old, 3 years at Ohio State, 6'3" and a quarter inch, 209 pounds, back-to-back seasons with 1,200 receiving yards, 14 touchdowns, the 2023 Fred Biletnikoff winner. What can't Marvin Harrison Jr. do at his size? I don't know that there's really anything.
Yeah, no, it's everything that he does, right? Like you said, it just can't get over just kind of how much of a natural he is really in all aspects of his position. And yeah, maybe, that shouldn't come as a surprise considering he's the son of a Hall of Fame wide receiver in Marvin Harrison Sr., right? But it's still so impressive to watch him, break his routes at the exact right moments, send corners in the wrong direction, fight through contact versus press, and use his weight and momentum to just make space at the right time to come down with the ball cleanly. Like, everything that he does, it looks effortless. His adjustments on the ball as well. And there are definitely times where he has to adjust. A lot of times I found, actually, at least relative to the top two guys, he's not, or the other top two guys, he's not getting, kind of the same level of quarterback play that a Neighbors or even Odunze is getting, which, when watching him, I know one of the knocks on him has been that kind of yak ability. And it's on the lower end, sure, the 32nd percentile among prospects since 2019. But I think part of it is that he's not always getting the ball in stride either, or nearly as often as some of these other wide receivers who we'll talk about in a bit, that are getting much better quarterback play. So that played into it with me. And I mean, we can get into some of the production numbers from him as well, but like, just elite, absolutely ridiculous production for his position. 2.98 career yards per route run, 93rd percentile since 2019. 91.3 career receiving grade, was 94th percentile. 2.87 yards per route run lined up in the slot, or lined up wide, which was 86th percentile. 3.63 yards per route run from the slot, which was 92nd percentile. 45.8% explosive play rate, 94th percentile. 94.5 receiving grade versus single coverage was 98th percentile. 4.63 yards per route run versus single coverage, 89th percentile. And a 17% first down and touchdown rate is 98th percentile. So everything
ridiculous.
that he does at an elite level, right?
Everything he does is at an elite level. And I really like what you mentioned about just everything looking so natural and so easy. And I will say, for a player of his size, that's not always the case. Like, what you love about him, he's a threat at every level of the field. He's got quicker feet than you would guess for a guy with that long a frame. He's a smooth route runner, again, for a man of any size, but especially for a guy of his frame. Elite body control. And really, the only knock I think you can come up with is the yards after the catch ability. But, like, for instance, in the 2023 season, ranked in the 37th percentile in catchable target rate, that does have a sincere impact
Yeah.
on your ability to reel in yards after the catch, because that elite ball placement can maximize so much for what you're able to do after the catch point. And it's something that Marvin Harrison Jr., in comparison to a Malik Nabers, didn't really have the benefit of.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes a huge difference, right? And like, you consider that catchable pass rate, and he's still putting this level of production up. Like, it's just
Ridiculous.
unbelievable. Yeah. So I mean, the guy he's a true, like, alpha wide receiver, right? In every sense of the word. I think he's landing spot proof. He's going to step into an offense and be the clear wide receiver one. There's not many that are going to steal targets from him. I think he's going to elevate whoever his NFL quarterback ends up being as well. Like, let's just say Marvin Harrison Jr. is him, right? Like,
Him.
he's so him. He could probably change his name to Marv Him Harris Him, the
Wow.
first at this point.
And that's it for today's PFF
There it is.
fantasy
Yeah.
podcast. We gotta end there. We gotta end there on a high note. I don't know, but
Yeah.
I think what isn't there to be said for Marvin Harrison Jr. He's as pro ready as it comes. Like,
Yeah.
you love the pedigree. You love the fact that he's been mentored by a Hall of Fame wide receiver literally since birth. I mean,
Yeah.
for me, I know for a lot of NFL teams right now, Malik Nabers is their top end wide receiver. But
Mhm.
I honestly think it's because Marvin Harrison Jr. is so good at everything, it's almost boring. And that's not any, like, for as much flash as Malik Nabers has, I think Marvin Harrison Jr. has as much flash, but because he's so good at everything, it sometimes, like, when you're so good at everything, it doesn't feel as meaningful or impactful. And I feel like that's the only thing we can come up with Marvin Harrison Jr. He's
Yeah.
so far my wide receiver one. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, and yeah, sure, it seems too good to be true type thing. Whatever the case is that they wouldn't have him as wide receiver one, but I'm all in. He's wide receiver one for me as well. I'd be taking him first overall in rookie drafts, any chance I get. Um, but yeah, we touched on Malik Nabers here just briefly, but let's get into him a little bit more. Out of LSU, another potential top 10 pick here. So with Neighbors, one of the first things that kind of stood out to me watching him is that he is like incredible with the ball in his hands, right? And for a smaller wide receiver, sure, you'd expect some shiftiness and speed to their game, but with Neighbors, one of the things that is most impressive about him is just how difficult he is to take down, like just constantly slipping out of tackles, bouncing off defenders, fighting for extra yardage. He had 6.6 yards after catch per reception for his career. That's clearly the best of those top three guys. And like you mentioned, quarterback play does play a part in that as well. But he's great at creating after the catch. He has an ability to take off in space with speed and make guys miss. Like you look at his missed tackles forced per reception for his career, 0.31, which is not just the best for this entire wide receiver class, but 99th percentile among all prospects since 2019. Like he's electric with the ball in his hand. So he's another guy that it's hard not to get excited about. Like I could see for sure why people have him as wide receiver one. So how about you? What do you like about Neighbors?
I mean, so explosive. He is an elite separator. He is fast. He's an insane vertical threat. So much speed. He is much more dynamic after the catch than, for instance, a Marvin Harrison Jr. Now, obviously, Jaden Daniels does play into that because the ball placement has been impeccable. Not a ton of concerns for him either. Like
Mhm.
for Marvin Harrison Jr., it was like yards after the catch. Really, not necessarily much to talk about with Neighbors either. Like a little bit smaller than Marvin Harrison Jr. And to that point, physicality isn't always the way that he's going to win. And you know, good thing is he doesn't really need to because usually he's faster than a lot of the guys on the football field. So I do think while I think Marvin Harrison Jr. Again, my wide receiver one. I understand the appeal with Neighbors. He's flashier at 1,569 receiving yards, 14 touchdowns this season with LSU. And that was playing alongside Brian Thomas, who was also very productive. I mean, this was an explosive offense top to bottom. And like all of these physical traits that you attribute in terms of athleticism, burst, he's got them all.
He does, yeah, and he's got the production to back it up as well, right? Like he's just an ideal profile for what you're looking for from a first round wide receiver, potential top 10 wide receiver, everything about him too. Like there's just very little red flags for him on tape and in his data as well, right? Like 87th percentile career yards per route run, 93rd percentile career receiving grade, 96th percentile career receiving grade versus single coverage. Like again, everything you'd want out of a wide receiver prospect and a super smooth route runner, whether he's working out of the slot or out wide as well. Like there's just so much to like. And yeah, I have no concerns about Neighbors in the NFL, whether he's the first wide receiver off the board, second, third, it makes no difference to me. I'd be very excited to get him in fantasy drafts. I think again, another guy that I think can hit the ground running in the NFL and be an immediate fantasy contributor as well, wherever he lands. So definitely a very exciting player there in Malik Neighbors. All right, let's go to another potential top 10 pick at the wide receiver position in this year's draft because two wasn't enough. Washington's Rome Odunze enters the conversation. So how are you feeling about Odunze out of Washington?
I'm going to give you a little spoiler here
Okay.
for my rankings here at the end of the show. Roma Dunze is actually my wide receiver two in this class over Malik Nabers. And might be a spicy take, but 21 years old, coming out of Washington, has just kind of this perfect height, size, speed combination for a guy tested well at the combine. does so many of the little things right, kind of like a Marvin Harrison Jr., where he's just super, super well rounded. Led the NCAA with 1,640 receiving yards in 2023, 13 receiving touchdowns, averaged 17.8 yards per reception, had year-over-year growth. Each of the past 3 seasons saw jumps in his target share, yards per reception average, touchdown total. Just plays with a ton of play strength. He's a tough dude, but he's a tough dude that has, I think, a lot of finesse that just has me absolutely enamored. I think he shows a lot of lower body strength in particular. Like there are times where he'll just like, you know, players on a tackle attempt are just dragged down the field. Like 19.3 breakout age, that's in the 84th percentile over the past 2 seasons, 95th percentile in receiving grade, 78th percentile in terms of separation percentage, 84th in yards per route run. Again, not like a yards after the catch maestro, but again, just one of these guys that I think is probably, outside of Marvin Harrison Jr., the safest overall wide receiver prospect in this class.
Yeah, he's another one. Like again, like you see watch him. It's very clear why he's going to be a top 10, a potential top 10 overall pick here. And Washington's offense too. Like they have, or I should say, I guess had a really nice offense there in 2023, but they built a lot of that around getting the ball into the hands of Odunze and letting him to go to work, right? Like there's a ton of wide receiver screens for him on tape where he's getting offensive linemen out in front of him, blocking for him, creating those yak opportunities, but also a go route specialist. 30% of his routes in 2023 were go routes. And not surprising considering that size speed combo, like you said, which is going to be key for him in the NFL as well. And just some really nice plays on tape where basically, when you're watching him on those go routes, he's the man that can do both, right? On those deep routes, he can shake defenders and get open, but also come down with those contested catches and win against tight coverage. So very exciting player. I mean, the other thing with Odunze, he was fed the ball a ton, like I said, in Washington's offense, but there were other guys there that were legitimate target competition between Jalen Polk and Jalen McMillan. So not too much of a surprise to see like his yard per route run figure below that of Harrison or Nabers, and was actually 9th among the Power 5 wide receivers in this year's class. So it's not like an overly exciting number, but I wrote up an article this past week looking at like personnel adjusted yards per route run for wide receivers, essentially looking at offenses that utilize more wide receivers on the field, how that makes it more difficult for each individual wide receiver to command a higher yards per route run total. And Odunze's actual yards per route run deviation, like over expected, was among the best in this year's class when taking that into account, indicating that his yards per route run total, his actual yards per route run total, that is, was actually more impressive when considering those less favorable situations. So all that to say, Odunze really is an elite wide receiver prospect, absolutely deserving of that top 10 pick. And he's, like you said, between 2 and 3, him or Nabers. It's like, it feels like Devontae Smith or Jalen Waddle for me in 2021, where I'm just happy with either one there. I don't care if it's as long as I'm getting one, I'm extremely happy. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I think honestly from a dynasty perspective, like if you end up with any of these 3 wide receivers, especially, long term, I don't think you're gonna have any complaints. Depending on landing spot, I also think each 3 of these could make an immediate impact in
Mhm.
redraft leagues. So like really just kind of depends on, where you're going to split hairs with these guys, maybe, kind of what you value. I think Nabers definitely a flashier overall wide receiver. I just think Odunze, generally speaking, I like I think he's just a little bit more play strength, which is a style that I kind of prefer in my wide receivers. But like, again, with these top prospects, we're splitting hairs.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely splitting hairs. Landing spot for sure going to play a part, right? Like there's talk of Odunze potentially going at 9 to Chicago, right? So it's a little bit more crowded in that offense with Keenan Allen and DJ Moore there. So you could see him becoming more of that consensus wide receiver 3 in redraft, at least for these rookies, if that were to be the case. But there's also going to be opportunity for him in other potential landing spots to come in and be the wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 at worst. So It's going to be fun. It's going to be really fun to see how this top 10 shakes out and where these three wide receivers go. And yeah, we'll get into the rest of them here in just a second. But first, I want to let you know about Fabric by Gerber Life. If you have a family, then you need to get term life insurance to protect them. It's one of the smartest financial decisions you can make, and the start of the new year is the perfect time to get it done so you can focus on whatever else the year has in store for you. Fabric was designed by parents for parents to help you get a high-quality, surprisingly affordable term life insurance policy in less than 10 minutes. Fabric has flexible policies that fit your family and your budget with quality policies like $1 million in coverage for less than $1 a day. Get your personalized quote in just minutes and then apply when it's convenient for you. It's all online and on your schedule. You can go from start to covered in less than 10 minutes with no health exam required. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to protect their family. Apply today in just minutes at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy, meetfabric.com/fantasy. Policies issued by Western Southern Life Insurance Company, not available in certain states. Prices subject to underwriting and health questions. All right, let's talk another LSU wide receiver and another likely first rounder as well. It's Mr. Brian Thomas Jr. So Thomas, I found really one of the more interesting players, I think. And I'll be curious where you're at with him because I constantly go back and forth on Thomas here and where I should rank him, kind of pre-draft without a landing spot. And we'll get to where I landed later, but I'll start with the positives for him because, you watch him on tape. I find it hard to basically not envision the upside that he'd have in the NFL, considering the size and the speed that he brings to the table, right? 4.33 40 time, 94th percentile. He's got good height at nearly 6'3". He had a 9.97 relative athletic score as well. Like the upside is absolutely there to work out for him in the NFL. You could see him joining a high-end passing offense as their vertical threat and being a weekly, like big play weapon. Then I could also see him joining a team whose offense isn't as ideal, unable to, utilize him as effectively, especially early in his NFL career, and then him not be that weekly fantasy option that we typically hope for out of a first round pick. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, almost his entire route tree, right? Last year, which was his 1 year as a starter, it was go routes and hitches. That's pretty much it. Like he had the occasional crossing route in there, but we're talking far from like a diverse route tree. And it's why part of me is worried that he's going to be kind of the one trick pony in the NFL and only have boom bust fantasy potential. So I, I definitely see the upside. I could get excited for him at times. And then there's other times where I get down on him. So I'm curious, where are you at with Thomas before, I get into some of his numbers here?
I'm in a similar boat to you. So like I think there's a lot to get enamored with, right? You have the height, weight, speed combination there. You mentioned it, like just under 6'3", and I mean to have that kind of length and that kind of speed, I mean, it's done. Like put him on the outside and let him run a go route. You see why he ran so many of them. But like generally just a natural wide receiver, a big catch radius, 89th percentile with his wingspan, 72nd percentile in arm length. Um, I think generally what we saw out of him, a lot of burst. He's a great athlete, but again, like the route tree kind of concerning. Not a refined route runner. I think probably got away with more because of that supreme athleticism, that burst. 1.5 second 10-yard split tells you everything you need to know about the kind of burst he has. And I do think that helped him in a lot of situations. So, do I see all of these physical traits that are really exciting for a wide receiver? Yes. But do I see somebody that's like pro ready as these other wide receiver prospects that we just reviewed? No, and that is why there's such a massive tier break here leading into Brian Thomas as, the consensus wide receiver 4 in this class.
Yeah, I'm with you. Like I could see why he'd be ranked as high as 4, like on our big board specifically as well, right? And then you look at, some of the reasons why he'd be ranked a lot lower, and his production profile is just kind of riddled with red flags, right? Like 1.95 career yards per route run is 28th percentile, 71.5 career receiving grade is 21st percentile. His yards per route run when lined up wide is 1.97. That's just 36th percentile. Even explosive play rate, just 32.3% is 34th percentile, right? So there, I know, he had Malik Nabers to contend with there, so maybe we could fit, forgive some of the per route numbers a little bit. And like you said, he's nowhere near finished product, so we can expect him to kind of continue developing and hopefully get better. But it is at least concerning that he performed so poorly, I think, relative to prospects past in these key metrics. And as much as I love the speed and I think he can absolutely get better in the NFL, I'm not convinced that it's worth a first round pick, which is where he's expected to go in most mocks. And his mock draft simulator ADP right now is, I think, 23rd overall. So he's in that range, and his production profile, sure, it puts him closer to probably like a fourth rounder, but obviously taking into account the athletic ability, he's much better than that. But I don't think I'd be looking at him until the second round if I'm an NFL team, to be honest. I don't know. I there's
I
times
think
I'm
what you're getting
optimistic, like I said.
enamored
Yeah.
with, if you're one of these teams taking him in the first round, is the potential, the
Mhm.
upside, the athlete, and
Yeah.
almost reminds me of like a Christian Watson coming out where you knew he had all of the like physical traits to be a top end wide receiver, but doesn't necessarily have the refinement as a route runner, as a um, an NFL player yet. And TBD, I'm not necessarily using Christian Watson as a comp for him. I'm not saying that Christian Watson is the range of outcomes for a player like him, but even maybe similar to like a Quentin Johnston, where,
Mhm.
had a lot of traits that you really like, but you might not necessarily expect a ton out of him immediately coming out of the gate.
Right. Yeah, I think Christian Watson's a good example, though, like you said, like how the NFL does fall in love with traits and values them very highly. I mean, if you want, to separate the comp even from the position, like look a couple years ago, Trayvon Walker going first overall, right? Like the NFL fell in love with that upside and that athletic ability. And I think it's going to be the same here with Brian Thomas. Obviously not going to go first overall, but he's going to be drafted highly, and it's because a team is going to fall in love with those traits. And for that reason, you can see the upside, but I think there's still some work in progress there with him as an NFL player. So I do worry about potential year one production from Brian Thomas, basically.
Yeah, probably a better, long-term dynasty asset than he's going to be here. But, potentially if he lands in a role with a quarterback that can deliver the ball downfield and get him on those go routes and open up an offense, like maybe there's some room there. I just can't envision him year one having a consistent sort of every down role in an offense.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. All right, let's head to Texas for a couple of interesting names coming out, actually, and we'll start with another speed freak and RAS stud in Adonai Mitchell. Kate, tell us about this potential first round wide receiver.
You mentioned the relative athletic score, ranked fifth among wide receivers. Fifth, like ever.
Crazy.
Fifth, since what, I think 1987,
Yeah,
dating
yeah.
back. Like, you are getting an absolute freak athlete in AD Mitchell. And what's so exciting about him is he does, like, this feels like just a very common thread with this class in general, is that unique combination of height, weight, speed. He's got it all. And you talk about elite size, body control, it's something that's very special. And what you like about him, like, because of that size, he can make catches outside of his body. He's got an above average wingspan. He's a pretty solid route runner for his size as well. Want to kind of shout out his overall profile, his production profile in particular, not necessarily the efficiency metrics, but that's gonna be the biggest hangup in his final season at Texas. So, posted 55 receptions, 845 receiving yards, 11 touchdowns after transferring from Georgia. Had 2 seasons there. Sophomore season at Georgia was one to forget, but one that was kind of marred by ankle injuries and missed, had this ankle sprain in week 2 of his second season. missed most of the year, kind of came back late and didn't see a whole lot before he eventually transferred to Texas, and then had to make his way into this Texas offense where Xavier Worthy had already kind of established him as this wide receiver one for the offense. So, never surpassed that 845 receiving yard mark, but not necessarily gonna ding him there for that second season at Georgia because of his overall health. Now, for as much as I like him, some weaknesses, not necessarily like despite the fact that he's big, and 6'2" and a quarter inch, 205 pounds, doesn't have as much play strength as you would think. 43.3% contested catch percentage over the course of his collegiate career. That ranks below average. The yards after the catch ability, probably the biggest red flag when it comes to AD Mitchell. Over the past 3 seasons, averaged 3 yards after the catch per reception. That ranked 353rd out of 356 qualifying wide receivers. Yeesh.
Yeah, that was a big red flag that I had written as well. It's just first percentile among prospects since 2019, right? And look, in a similar vein as Brian Thomas is Adonai Mitchell, we have these kind of lanky, athletic speedsters, right? Who have this untapped potential as far as kind of what they can be in the NFL and how teams can utilize them to become like true offensive weapons. And I think the upside is absolutely there with Mitchell as much as it is with Thomas. The problem for me was as well, like you mentioned, the production profile as far as efficiency metrics go, it's pretty poor, to say the least. And definitely some of that has to do with different offenses and dealing with injuries as well. But 1.68 career yards per route run, being 13th percentile among prospects since 2019. Like even his best career season in terms of yards per route run at 1.72 is just third percentile since 2019. And then like receiving grade, yards per route run from different alignments, they're all well below average. Career missed tackles forced at per reception, just 15th percentile. So even with that yak ability being really low too, like there's reasons why that is. He's not making guys miss in the open field. So I struggled to find like a lot of positives in his actual like college production with basically the shining light of his profile being in his adjusted separation rate. So open target rate on throws 10 plus yards downfield. Basically, he ranked 82nd percentile among prospects there and finished with a 76th percentile explosive play rate, which you would hope to see from these kind of speedsters. And he was better than Thomas in that regard as well, right? So his route tree was also a bit more diverse than a Brian Thomas, even though it is still very heavy on the go routes and the hitches, like most vertical threats are. But there is a bit more to his game as far as kind of the underneath stuff, like slants, crossing routes, those ins and outs as well, right? Which was nice to see. But yeah, I did. I found more red flags for him as well, kind of when doing the personnel adjusted yards per route run. Like he was put in more favorable situations with fewer wide receivers on the field at once, but failed to kind of deliver at a rate that you'd hope to see from potential first round wide receivers. And as highlighted in the article, which you could check out for free on pff.com now, that success rate for those lower performers in yards per route run over expected is actually quite low. So those things were definitely concerning for me. But again, like you see the upside, you see why this class is considered so deep, is that they have these guys like these athletic speedsters, like Adonai Mitchell, like a Brian Thomas, that can absolutely work out once they get to the NFL. And again, they're not finished products coming out of college, so there's still work to be done there, and it's hard to shut the door on them completely because of poor production profiles, basically.
Yeah, very, very fair.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the other Texas wide receiver now, and another absolute speed freak who ran a 4.21 40 time at the combine. It's Xavier Worthy. He was not one of the top 8 wide receivers on the PFF big board, but a combine riser for a lot of people. So definitely worth kind of discussing here among so many wide receivers that are worth discussing who we weren't able to cover. We aren't able to cover them all here today, but he is smaller than AD Mitchell, 5'11", 165, very small for a wide receiver. So I think right there you find some of the concerns right away when translating to the NFL. But that being said, he was used a lot outside, a lot more at Texas, but I'd imagine, he fits better in the slot in the NFL and can still serve as like a vertical threat. Um, Also has a more nuanced route tree relative to like a Brian Thomas, for example, just with a ton more wide receiver screens too, right? Like those screens do speak to the team, I think, wanting to get the ball in his hands, because with that speed and quickness comes a ton of playmaking potential as well. And I wouldn't be surprised to see him used in a similar way in the NFL. He's probably not a guy that teams will be spending a first round pick on, even with that elite athletic ability. There's just, some of the size concerns, and then maybe not to the extent of Thomas and AD Mitchell production profile concerns, but they are still there for him in a way, and that he's just kind of closer to average, and profile's probably closer to like a late day 2 type pick in the draft without factoring in, much of his athleticism. He's probably going to go earlier than that. So, yeah, where were you at with Worthy? Did well, we won't give it away. I was going to say, do you like him better than Mitchell? But let's save that. I'll just see where you're at with Worthy.
We can save that. Yeah, we can save that. I mean, like, look, there's a lot of things to like about Xavier Worthy. Like speed and separation, that is the name of the game for Xavier Worthy. And like, no surprise, he ran a 4.21 40-yard dash. Like past 3 seasons, ranks 93rd percentile with an 83.9% open target rate. Just fast. He can be utilized all over the field. He could be kind of a gadget player. Once you get the ball in his hands and let him make plays after the catch, that's where he is going to win. And, in terms of production profile, not necessarily elite, but there is one metric that analytics fans are going to really, really like about Xavier Worthy, and it's his 18.4 breakout age, which ranks in the 97th percentile for wide receivers. As a true freshman in 2021 at Texas, ranked 77th percentile or better in yards per route run, yards after the catch per reception, and separation percentage. I think, generally speaking, you're going to be maybe a little bit more disappointed that we didn't see a higher ceiling for him, especially in 2023. We saw AD Mitchell utilized a lot more, than maybe we would have liked, considering Xavier Worthy was already established in that offense. But was still the wide receiver one, just didn't necessarily see a ton of like year over year growth. Like what we saw as a true freshman was kind of what we ended up getting in for most of his career. But I do want to shout out just the fact that I think he's a really good, solid wide receiver. The biggest question for me is just going to be the play strength. 11th percentile and contested catch rate over his 3 seasons at Texas. He plays like he's 165 pounds in the worst way.
Yeah, that becomes a lot harder to do at the NFL level as well, right? So, yeah, you mentioned it. I mean, you wish to see higher, at least efficiency marks for him, but they're not like terrible. They're just closer to average, I guess, for the prospects coming out over the past few years, right? And if you're watching on YouTube, you could see the graphic there: 51st percentile career yards per route run, as well as 51st percentile career receiving grade, even explosive play rate for a guy with that speed, 49th percentile. Yeah, missed tackles forced per reception, 47th percentile, yards per route run versus single coverage, 55th percentile. So you mentioned it too, like he did a nice job separating, and then you look at adjusted separation rate, which is 10 plus yards downfield, 38% open target rate in that regard, which was 78th percentile, and really good, yards after catch per reception as well, which you'd hope to see with all those wide receiver screens as well. He was 80th percentile there. So I think there's definitely a role for him in the NFL as a wide receiver that you can involve in the offense at a high rate, get the ball in his hands around the line of scrimmage, let him go to work kind of thing, as well as the occasional vertical threat. But I think that, the NFL team that drafts him is going to have to be a creative one to make him like a consistent fantasy asset, basically. So for Worthy, I found myself getting kind of hung up on potential landing spot for him. I think that's going to be particularly important here for him. But yeah, I again I like all these wide receivers, which is I feel like I have to point out some of the negatives just to kind of separate these guys a little bit. But really, like again, you're looking at upside and stuff with these guys, and it is a very exciting class and as far as potential goes.
And I do want to say, Xavier Worthy, like he has time, right? He has time
Mhm.
to put on a little bit of muscle. He's 5'11". Like that's not great for a wide receiver, but it's not the end of the world. He's the 165 pounds. It's a lot to get over. But also, again, 20 years old. He's going to turn 21, just ahead of the NFL draft here. And I do think like that gives him some time to put on muscle conceivably over the next couple of seasons once he's actually conditioned for the NFL and maybe makes an effort to put on some of that muscle. I can foresee that happening, and I do think landing spot is going to be key. Like I don't want him seeing I don't wanna see him going to, like, the AFC North where they're gonna play
Mm.
a physical brand of defensive football. I don't wanna see that. I think that, I don't wanna see him going to a place with, that where he's gonna be able to, get bullied by his common opponents. Like, I want a situation where maybe he doesn't necessarily have to be the number 1 and he can just play his brand of speed and separation and we don't have to worry about these contested catch situations that he's not necessarily going to excel in.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you. I think, yeah, landing spot again, I think is going to be particularly important for somebody like Xavier Worthy. All right, a couple wide receivers left for today. We got Lad McConkey up next, the productive little guy out of Georgia. Kate, McConkey is fun to say, but was he fun to watch, in your opinion?
So fun to watch. Lad
Yeah.
McConkey, probably one of my favorite prospects. And watching him, I got like these little tinglies, the same way that I got like about Tank Dell, where you look at the situation, you look at the type of player he is, and you wonder, like, can he really be productive for fantasy? And, you don't know. But like from a pure football standpoint, you see why Lad McConkey has first round potential in the NFL draft because there are going to be a lot of teams that are kind of enamored with the traits that he has. He's a good athlete, ran in the 4.3s, small, yes, just under 6 foot, 186 pounds, but like he's got still some muscle for him. He's not all lanky. Um, you know, small hands, short arms, like just not from a size. He's a compact human, but offers a ton of burst. Now, I do think, from a production standpoint, people are going to see his college stats. They're probably going to be a little bit nervous. Now, final season at Georgia, played in, had a redshirt freshman year, came in 2021, posted a solid 447 yards, 5 touchdowns. 2022 built on that, 762 yards, 7 touchdowns, and then all things went south in 2023, which I think we could have had a really solid year. Missed the first 4 games of the 2023 season with a back injury. Then an ankle injury forced him out of the game midseason against Tennessee. Missed the following week. Just wasn't fully healthy in 2023. But what there is to like about him, he is one of the best route runners in this class. He can put a defensive back on their butt because of just the manipulation mid route. And I think that just generally speaking showed up a lot on tape and in terms of the analytics, the missed forced tackles per reception, everything about Lad McConkey, I think you saw translate pretty well both between the tape and the statistical profile in terms of advanced metrics. It's really just those face value stats, like the actual box score that's going to have you hesitating, but generally speaking, I think it's kind of meaningless when you consider the circumstances.
I'm with you, and also contending with the player that's actually pictured on the YouTube screen in Brock Bowers. That's not Lad McConkey. I just realized that's my fault for not picking up on that earlier. But yeah, he's he is absolutely a fun player, right? Like you said, he's on the smaller side, 5'11", 186, so a bit thicker than Xavier Worthy, though probably another slot type wide receiver here, which we know can be fine in the NFL. It was definitely more productive working out of the slot for his college career as well. 2.84 yards per route run from the slot, which was 76th percentile, versus the 2.37 out wide, which was 65th percentile. And you mentioned it. He's an excellent route runner as well, and that shows in how Georgia utilized him in a variety of different ways, whether it was deep routes, a bunch as a crosser, and underneath, and those ins and outs, slants, on top of a bunch of wide receiver screens as well, because they want to get the ball in his hands. So again, just a fun player that you can utilize in any kind of offense. He's a good separator downfield as well. 38% open target rate on those 10 plus ADOT throws, which was 78th percentile. Just has a really great feel for finding the holes in zone coverages, as well as how to win one-on-one with leverage and with quick breaks on his routes. So I'm with you. I loved Lad McConkey. You mentioned the missed tackles forced, the yards after catch, things like that he can do once the ball's in his hands. And you could just, I think, use him in so many different ways. And I think that helps him fit so many NFL offenses, that I feel fairly confident in him as a potential fantasy starter, regardless of kind of where he lands, for the most part. And obviously, the injury stuff it is a bit of a concern as well. But yeah, I just came away feeling excited about him, about his potential in the NFL, especially as a potential first round pick. And yeah, there's going to be some lower per route numbers for him, I think, as well, because again, he has to contend with the generational Brock Bowers for targets and yardage in Georgia's offense. But I think factoring that in, and knowing that he's not likely to be a number one wide receiver in the NFL anyways, and just seeing that he can still be productive with an alpha target earner in an offense is still a very encouraging sign. So yeah, I came away feeling pretty excited about Lad McConkey.
I'm gonna like I'm probably I probably have just a few more question marks in terms of the translation to fantasy. But like, let me say, face value, fantasy aside, I know this is the fantasy podcast, but like from a NFL readiness standpoint, from a skill standpoint, from the ability to play the wide receiver, I'd make the argument that Lad McConkey is probably the fourth best wide receiver in this class. I know there's like the size concerns. He can put on some more muscle at the next level. Again, like a little bit older than some of the other wide receivers that we talked about here. He's 22, will turn 23 in November, but still time to put on a little bit of bulk. But from a skill perspective, from a tools perspective of just playing the wide receiver position, I'd argue he's wide receiver 4 in this class. Like, it doesn't have maybe the flash and the body and the top end speed that like a Brian Thomas has, but a much more diverse skill set, I think, that's going to translate to a lot of different NFL teams that, again, you can kind of plug and play him in any type of offense because he can play out wide, he can play in the slot. I want to see him get to a place where, he's going to have some PPR upside though. I think he's capable of being a volume guy at the next level. I want him to land in a spot where he doesn't get, you know, put into a situation where he's like the third option on a roster. And because I think this dude deserves volume and I think he's got the skill set to handle it.
Yeah, absolutely. Good way to put it. All right, last but certainly not least, at least as far as I'm concerned, he's the number 7 ranked wide receiver on the PFF big board, out of Oregon. It is Troy freaking Franklin. So one of the lightest wide receivers in this class as well. Like, he's lanky as hell, but man, he is exciting. Like, I keep going back to his tape, and I keep finding more things to love. So to me, he stands out as another one of those wide receivers who just has such like a strong feel for the game and the field and in how he's able to get open and optimize himself as a target. He can separate as a deep threat as well as in those intermediate areas of the field where he's, just constantly making himself like a QB friendly target by working back to the ball or feeling where a defender is and just creating that little adjustment for a little bit more space. He's also not afraid to catch those passes in the middle of the field where contact is coming in. Just despite the thinner frame, he's able to hang in there, make contested catches, or make adjustments on the ball deep downfield, which I noticed he had to do quite a bit. We touched on Bo Nix's deep ball accuracy last week and that it wasn't necessarily the best, but Franklin helps his case there by working back to the ball and fighting through contact. Not necessarily as nuanced of a route tree as someone like a Lad McConkey, for example, but it's not terrible in that he isn't just a deep threat. He's able to earn targets kind of regardless of where or regardless of what he's running on the field. And that's particularly encouraging, I found, for him as a potential number one wide receiver in the NFL at some point as he kind of continues to develop. And like his production profile also super positive, 89th percentile profile, just behind Odunze. Career yards per route run is 2.63, which is slightly better than Odunze in the 80th percentile. 2.64 yards per route run when lined up wide, 79th percentile. 40.6% explosive play rate, 75th percentile. 5.1 career yards per route run versus single coverage is 94th percentile. And then a 45% adjusted separation rate is 92nd percentile. I love Troy Franklin. Spoilers. He's ranked fairly high for me. I think, there's even some untapped potential there with him that would just make him all the more dangerous at the NFL level as well. Like if he can pack on some weight, obviously get a little stronger, I think, his game and production can definitely still translate since he has such a strong feel for the game and he has some speed to spare as well. So, I love Troy Franklin. I'll be curious to see where you're at with him because I know he's not everybody's cup of tea.
I'm not nearly as high, but you made an excellent case. I mean, definitely want to see him put on a little bit of weight, 176 pounds on a 6'2" frame. He's slight.
Yeah.
Ran a 4.41 40-yard dash, which you love. He's explosive, 39-inch vertical jump. Like I think the biggest concerns for me definitely lie in the overall frame of Troy Franklin, which again can build on, but it is a stark contrast. Even like Lad McConkey has, I think, a lot more bulk, less lanky, just overall more compact. Lad McConkey is. Troy Franklin's just he's lanky and it's hard. I mean, the good thing is like it's not necessarily a length problem. So like the length is excellent. Um, I think generally speaking, you like to see the way that he moves for the size, which again, just a very common theme in this draft class. But probably the biggest concern for me is the route tree and how limited that is. It makes me just curious, like for how excellent the production profile is. How is that going to translate in the NFL when he's asked to do a lot more? And is he ready? Like, is he ready to be asked more of? Um, it's hard for me to say, and that's probably my biggest pinch point for his production in the next level is how refined is he really? I'm not sure I feel confident enough answering that at this point.
I think that's fair. And look, yeah, like we said, it is a lot of go routes for him on tape. It's not nearly the refined route tree that I think, you're kind of hoping for from a potential first round pick either. So I definitely get it. I think just for me, kind of watching him and just seeing again that kind of feel for the game and ability to still run those routes even though he doesn't do it often. You definitely see the potential for him to be able to develop there if he was asked to do it a little bit more. So I feel more confident than you, I guess, for Franklin, and that's okay. Like there's a reason that he's considered like a later first round pick at best here, as opposed to early on in the draft. And because he's not a perfect prospect, but I came away feeling very excited about Troy Franklin here. And yeah, 28th overall, the Buffalo Bills are picking. I would love to
Mm.
see Troy Franklin there. Obviously, I think they're going to trade up to potentially grab somebody a little bit earlier, probably not too high, but I would be excited about that fit, for example.
I think that's fair.
Um, all right, rankings time. I know that we were pretty perfectly aligned with our quarterback rankings last episode, but I imagine we'll have some differences among our top 8 wide receivers here in where they land, just because it's a mixed bag of options, and even at the very top we have an argument for any of those 3 guys to be number 1. So Kate, we'll start at the top. I think you already mentioned it. Marvin Harrison Jr. Is wide receiver 1 for you. He is as well for me.
Yep. I think where things get interesting, I mentioned Rome Odunze, my wide receiver 2. Again, it's kind of like 1A, 1B with Malik Nabers, but I'm just going to give my slight preference to Rome Odunze. How egregious do you think this is? Because I'm going to guess you have Nabers as your wide receiver 2.
Yeah, I have Neighbors wide receiver 2. But I don't think it's egregious. Like I said, I would be very happy with either one of these guys. Like these are the top end of consolation prizes. If you're not getting Marvin Harrison, or if you're not getting, number 2 on your board versus number 3. So these guys are very, very good. I think there's absolutely day 1 potential for them as fantasy assets as well. So I'm with you. I got them as basically like a 2A, 2B type situation, but I do give the edge to Neighbors for me with Marvin Harrison number 1. So that first tier is still locked in. Like there's I don't think anybody else entering that conversation. So where it does get more interesting is outside of that tier. So who do you have at number 4?
I've got Brian Thomas Jr., who I think is pretty much like consensus wide receiver 4 at this point. I did mention that, like, fantasy aside, Lad McConkey is like my
Mhm.
true NFL wide receiver 4 at this point. But I do just because of like maybe fantasy upside and looking at some of those athletic traits and kind of projecting that forward, the size, all of that put together, paired with maybe some higher draft capital for Brian Thomas, I think probably gives him the edge for me. Is he your wide receiver 4 as well?
He's not. That is
Ooh.
where I put in
Let me
Troy
guess, Troy
Franklin.
Franklin.
Yeah, I moved Troy Franklin to my wide receiver 4 after all things considered, right? Like with between the tape and the production profile, I love Troy Franklin. So it was hard for me to put anybody else outside of the big 3 there ahead of him. And I know like the skinny lankiness of him is going to be a concern for sure, but I don't know. I have faith that he can still translate to the NFL. I think there's still a lot to like about his game, and yeah, the production profile as well, like added on to what I liked from him on tape was just the everything I needed to kind of put him at the top of this second tier for me.
I think that's fair. Now, is Brian Thomas your wide receiver 5?
So Brian Thomas
Let's
is
roll down the
not.
list. Let's go from
Yeah,
your wide receiver 4, Troy Franklin. Let's roll down the rest of your list, and then we'll close out with the rest of my list
sure,
because it seems like we're gonna have
sure.
some shakeups and some differences here.
We got some differences, yeah. So I do not have Brian Thomas as number 5. I have Lad McConkey out of Georgia as number
I love
5.
that.
Yeah, so I again another guy that I really liked. Again, tape wise, I know he's on the smaller side, but his potential as like a full-time slot wide receiver in the NFL with his route running ability, with his pass production, with his ability to still earn targets in that Georgia offense, competing with Brock Bowers and a lot of offensive weapons there. Like I'm feeling pretty confident about Lad McConkey. I think, first round as far as first round wide receivers go, he's kind of I have 5 guys that I would take in the first round, and he's the last of the bunch there. So that's where kind of the tier break happens for me, is after McConkey. And yeah, and at number 6 is where I have Brian Thomas Jr. So this third tier for me, was super close. It had Brian Thomas at 6, Adonai Mitchell at 7, and Xavier Worthy at 8. These guys, again, I moved around a ton. There was a time where I had Brian Thomas in the second tier as well, but I just fell less in love with him, I guess, as far as what he's shown so far, and understanding that I think he's going to take some time. But yeah, Brian Thomas, I still like the upside. I like the production profile a little bit better than Adonai Mitchell. But that was kind of the tiebreaker for me, was that production profile. The one for Mitchell does scare me a little bit. So I've cooled on him. He's at 7, and then Xavier Worthy at 8.
I think that's all very fair. Lad McConkey is one that, like, I keep wanting to move further and further up my draft board. And I'm going to be honest, this next tier, I have shuffled around
Yeah.
left and right, and it depends on which way the wind is blowing. So, based on the trajectory of where the wind is blowing right now here in Houston, Texas, as we're recording this, I'm going to go with Lad McConkey. I think you're right. At wide receiver 5, I'll be bold here. I'm actually going to go with Xavier Worthy as wide receiver 6,
Nice.
who I think is just a better overall wide receiver. Obviously, frame concerns, like size concerns, but in terms of, like, just his natural ability as a wide receiver, I'll take him over a guy like Troy Franklin or AD Mitchell. Then I'll take Troy Franklin, then I'll take AD Mitchell. So for me, it's Marvin Harrison Jr., Rome Odunze, Malik Nabers in that first tier. Then I've got Brian Thomas, Lad McConkey, Xavier Worthy, Troy Franklin, and finally AD Mitchell at wide receiver 8.
Nice. Yeah. So that I definitely understand that for sure. I've had that kind of similar order already with these guys before. This is where I
Don't
am
worry,
right now.
tomorrow it'll be totally different.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to write up rankings at some point, and I'm sure there's going to be some changes. But yeah, I got Marvin Harrison 1, Malik Nabers 2, Rome Odunze 3, then a tier break for Troy Franklin 4, Lad McConkey 5, another tier break, Brian Thomas, Adonai Mitchell, Xavier Worthy for me. So there's plenty of wide receivers in this class that are going to be worthy of that top 8, top 10, however you want to look at it. I mean, we might have to get into the wide receiver position again at some point here, but yeah, that is going to do it for today's episode. At least, thank you all very much for tuning in and following along here. And next week, I'm sure we're going to go into another position, probably running backs. I'm going to guess. We'll see how it goes. But Kate, as always, thank you very much for coming on here and lending your thoughts and expertise on these prospects. I really do look forward to doing this every week, and look forward to doing it again with you as well.
Thanks for having me. Give me a follow on Twitter at Kate Magdziuk, and follow along with my wide receiver ranking shuffle all off season long, because I have a feeling I'm just going to be tinkering. And that's where we're at with this
Yeah.
class, because there's a lot to love about so many of these different prospects. And they all have, like, very different things that I think they offer. So we're going to have a lot of things to talk about, I think, especially after the draft, once we have some landing spots here, because again, size, speed, athleticism, that's like the name of the game for this class. And I'm going to say NFL teams and our fantasy football teams probably going to be pretty spoiled here in the season to come.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's going to be exciting. We're definitely going to have to, sort it out again after the draft, once all these landing spots kind of come to fruition, and we see where guys end up and which offenses, because there's a ton of potential here for fantasy purposes. But we'll get into all that at some point as well down the road. And yeah, as far as this podcast goes, if you're looking for more draft talk or prospect talk on the defensive side of the ball, whether it's IDP or just want to know more about these defensive prospects, we will have another episode here later in the week talking rookie edge defenders, which is going to be a lot of fun. We got my guy Joseph Hagan, aka Joey the Tooth from Football Guys, joining me, so be sure to check that out as well. Don't forget to use the promo code 30MDS and check out the PFF draft guide. Get 30% off an annual subscription, all of that fun stuff, and the mock draft simulator as well. But yeah, other than that, we got a ton of draft content up on the site on pff.com. I've written up the analytical strengths and weaknesses at the top of the quarterback, wide receiver, tight end, and running back classes, as well as some analytics sleepers for wide receiver and running back. Wrote up that personnel adjusted yards per route run piece as well for the wide receivers. But yeah, check it all out. It's draft season. Again, stay locked in. We will continue to keep you covered here on PFF and at the PFF Fantasy Podcast. And until next time, peace out.